Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for being in our class today. I hate to stop all this good visiting, but the scriptural clock on the front up here tells us that it's time to begin. I know this is a holiday weekend, and we're missing a few folks, but we're glad you're here today. Appreciate your participation in our class. This is week number 5, and thus it is lesson number 5 in our current quarterly study that is entitled David and Solomon. I hope you brought your Bible this morning. We are in the 18th chapter of the book of 2 Samuel. And we are continuing the story at this point of Absalom, the third son of King David, who is attempting to overthrow his father's kingdom and to claim the throne of Israel for himself. In the context of all that we have been reading and studying over the past few weeks, David, his household, his mighty men, his closest followers have all now fled Jerusalem. Ahithophel, David's chief advisor, has basically defected. He's gone over to Absalom's side, but God is still in control of the destiny of his people. And I thought a lot about that this week as I thought about this entire story and the family struggle that was going on in David's household. David does not own the throne. David does not control the throne. It does not belong to him. And I think that's an important point to be remembered just here. And we're all familiar with that whole story about how Israel wanted a king and everybody else has a king and we want a king too. And I can't help but remember God saying, no, you don't. You just think you do, but you really don't. This is not what you want. And I think about how offended God must have been that basically his people were in effect rejecting his leadership and wanting the leadership of a king. And so their wish was granted. And you know, sometimes you live long enough to decide that something that I really wanted is not what I wanted after all. But in this particular case, I think it's important to remember here that the throne really does not belong to David. It does not belong to Absalom. It does not belong to Ahithophel. It does not belong to any man. The throne belongs to God ultimately. And it is God who will decide who will rule over Israel, no matter what contending parties might think. It is God who will decide who sits on the throne of Israel. Now, in our previous readings and in the previous chapter, Ahithophel has advised Absalom to go after David, basically, and to do it very quickly. David's on the run. His people are scattered. His life is in disarray. And Ahithophel, who is in fact regarded as the advisor of the day, I mean, he is seen as the advisor of all advisors. He tells Absalom, if you're going to do this, you need to do it now. You need to do it quickly. You need to go get him while he is down and get this done. Kill only David, and when that is done, everyone else, all the people will turn to you. They will follow you. We've talked about this a couple of times. I've mentioned it, and so has Dr. Lloyd, that Ahithophel has a personal motive for revenge against King David. Do you remember what it was? Bathsheba was his granddaughter. But there is another advisor in this story, and I think I'm pronouncing his name right. His name is Hushai. That's correct, Hushai. Hushai is loyal to David, and he wants to be with David. He wants to serve David, even though the circumstances at the moment are not very good. In fact, David is on the run. And so David convinces him that if he would go to Absalom and tell him that he was no longer David's servant, give him some bad advice whenever possible, spy on him, send word back of what Absalom is planning to do, that would be what would be most helpful. And Hushai agrees to do it. So Ahithophel has advised Absalom to go and take David out and take the throne of his father. Hushai has advised Absalom That is not such a good idea, and that what he should do instead is this. He should muster all the forces of Israel who will come with him, as many as the sand on the seashore, and he should go after not only David, but go after all who are loyal to David, all of David's men, and wipe them out. Absalom is a very vain man. I think we've established that. And so Hushai tells him, and not only should you do this, but you should lead the charge yourself, and as you do that, all of the glory will come to you. You'll get all the glory for what happens. And for the first time, the counsel and the advice of Ahithophel, who some said was to be nearly as wise as God, was ignored. And the advice of someone else was taken. So the plan has been decided. We will gather all of our forces together. We will go after David, and we'll settle this once and for all. We will take the throne by force. Well, there are a number of other significant events in this whole drama that I would encourage you to just read on your own in chapter 17, including the suicide of Ahithophel, who understood what was going to happen. He was a wise man, and he understood that Absalom was destined to fail, and he also understood the results, the consequences of that when Absalom failed, everyone with him would be doomed as well. Additionally, I'd like for all of us to remember just here that there has been a change in David's relationship with God. It's been a change in a positive way as a result of the things that David has done and the consequences that he must bear. David has now grown in his relationship with God to the extent, to the point in his life that he's willing to say, the outcome for all of this is no longer up to me. The outcome is really up to God. If God wants Absalom to be king, Absalom will be king. That's out of my hands. If God wants me back in Jerusalem, if he wants me back on the throne, if he will allow me to see the Ark of the Covenant once again, he will put me there. Whatever happens, and however this all works out, David has grown and has matured in his relationship to the extent that he says all of this is in the hands of God. And that was so very true. And what we are seeing and what we are reading is the unfolding will of the one who is indeed in control. So, Dr. Lloyd led our thoughts last week as Absalom now has full control of the army of Israel. It is good for his ego. It will be bad on the battlefield. The result will not be good. And Absalom makes a guy named Amasa the captain of the army instead of Joab. And Amasa was the son of a niece of David and a cousin of Joab. So David is in a very bad place. He could very well lose his life. It looks like at this point that he is certainly going to lose the throne. And though it is not in a text that we're going to read, you get a hint in the story of how the tables begin to turn. They are starting to turn as in the midst of all of this drama, you read of some individuals who show up and they bring sleeping mats and cooking pots and serving bowls and lots of food for David and those who are with him. These helpers of David, they were not dramatic warriors that you read of great accomplishments on the battlefield, but they helped David. They helped him at a critical time. They helped David in a time of crisis as much as the bravest soldiers. And I think the inference of the text is clear that they were specifically sent by God to comfort David in his time of affliction. They bring utensils and ingredients and everything needed to prepare food and to feed David and his people who are hungry and tired and thirsty, and to give them some hope and some encouragements. And so you come to chapter 18, where we were in the story last week, and Absalom's plan is underway. But the plan as had been advised to him and the plan as he had made it was not going exactly as he had hoped. David's men have actually beaten back the Israelite defectors. And you remember from our discussion last week, 20,000 men have died that day. And it was an ugly, ugly, brutal scene. But let us not forget the plea of David that I want you to just revisit for a moment there in verse 5, because it's critical to the story. The king commanded Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, "Be gentle with the young man Absalom for my sake." And all the troops heard the king giving orders concerning Absalom to each of the commanders. It's really interesting to me. After all that Absalom had done, David wanted it clearly known that he was to be captured alive and not mistreated in any way. And the text indicates that David gave this command in the presence of all the people so that everyone would hear it, so that his captains would feel great pressure not to harm his son, not to do him in. But you and I know, because we've read the end of the story, that it did not end up that way. It's also worth mentioning one more time that the text says that the woods devoured more people that day than did the sword. And that's an interesting statement to me. If you read about it, the phrase implies that God fought for David in unusual ways. Soldiers loyal to Absalom just seemed to get swallowed up by the woods. Adam Clark in his commentary writes, "It is generally supposed that during the battle, when the army was broken, they fled into the woods and they fell into pits and swamps and so forth, where they became entangled." In the Arabic translation of this, it says that they were devoured by wild beasts in the woods. Now, I don't know specifically or exactly which is correct, but I will tell you that God is at work here. The hand of God and the plan of God is very much at work. And then if we could, I'd like to just reread the climax of all of this. And that's going to be verses 9 through 17 before we get to the text we're reading for today. Now, Absalom happened to meet David's men. He was riding his mule. You got the picture? And as the mule went under the thick branches of a large oak, Absalom's head got caught in the tree. And he was left hanging in midair, while the mule he was riding kept on going. I sort of chuckle at that a little bit. When one of the men saw this, he told Joab, "I just saw Absalom hanging in an oak tree." And Joab said to the man who had told him this, "What? You saw him? Why didn't you strike him to the ground right there? Then I would have had to give you 10 shekels of silver and a warrior's belt." But the man replied, "Even if 1,000 shekels were weighed out into my hands, I would not lift my hand against the king's son. In our hearing, the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, protect the young man Absalom for my sake. And if I had put my life in jeopardy and nothing is hidden from the king, you would have kept your distance from me." Joab said, "I'm not going to wait like this for you." So he took 3 javelins in his hand and plunged them into Absalom's heart while Absalom was still alive in the oak tree. And 10 of Joab's armor bearers surrounded Absalom, struck and killed him. Then Joab sounded the trumpet, and the troops stopped pursuing Israel, for Joab halted them. They took Absalom, threw him into a big pit in the forest, and piled up a large heap of rocks over him. Meanwhile, all the Israelites fled to their homes. That's sort of where we stopped last week. There's so much about this that I have interest in. It's interesting to me about Absalom riding the mule and getting caught in a low branch, a low limb. When I was a kid growing up, we had a horse, and we'd ride that horse, and every now and then we'd have some friends from school, and on one particular occasion, some friends from church came, and everybody always wanted to come and ride the horse. So we saddled the horse, and we put this friend on the horse. Well, they went over the hill a little bit out of sight, and in a few minutes, the friend came back crying. Wasn't hurt, had not been injured, but came back crying. "I lost your horse. I lost your horse. I don't know what to do. I lost your horse." The whole time, the horse was in the barn laughing about the whole thing, because what the horse knew to do was, if this was a person who had not ridden her, she knew that there was a particular tree. It was an oak tree, in fact. It had a low limb, and just like a fly on her back or something that was bothering her, she would just go right for that low limb, rake them right off of her back, and she'd head back to the barn. And I sort of envision that, I sort of picture that a little bit. In Absalom's case, the mule said, you know, here's this low limb. I'm going to get rid of this guy on my back before I get caught up in his mischief. Maybe that's true, maybe that's not. But Absalom's vanity put him in this battle against the wise counsel of Ahithophel. And you read this and I'm having trouble in my mind getting the picture of some great general riding a mule who just drug him off under a low limb into battle, you know? Now remember, we learned this 2 or 3 weeks ago when it was my turn. We learned that Absalom was the best looking guy of all Israel. You remember he cut his hair once a year and it weighed 5.5 pounds. And here he now is literally caught by the head, perhaps his own hair in a low limb, and the mule just runs off. And actually the original text does not say, as Dr. Lloyd pointed out last week, that he was caught by his hair. We just assume that. He might have been caught by his neck. However he was caught, he was caught. And this was reported to Joab, and the man who reported it was questioned, why didn't you just go ahead and immediately kill Absalom? And the man replied, I didn't do it because I heard the king's instructions. I heard him give you the instructions. I heard him give the instructions in front of everyone about how we were to deal with his son if we encountered him. Joab didn't care. He did not care. He did not hesitate to strike Absalom, even though he knew David commanded him not to do it. I'm going to try and get in Joab's skin for just a moment. Joab was convinced that it was in David's best interest, and it was in Israel's best interest to give Absalom justice, not mercy. Don't forget that Absalom was a murderer, he was a traitor, he was a rapist, and Joab knew that David was generally very indulgent towards his children and would likely, based on his past track record, never truly punish Absalom. He had seen David's action, he had seen David's lack of action when Absalom had done wrong before. So Joab believed that it was in the highest interest of the kingdom to just do away with Absalom. So you might say that Joab was correct, but he was not right. He was correct in his understanding that it would indeed be better off for David, and it would indeed be better off for Israel if Absalom was dead. He was not right in disobeying the king, who was the God-appointed authority over him. As I read this whole story, I find it ironic that the rebel Absalom had his own life taken by a rebellious act committed by Joab. Now, I would not hesitate to tell you this morning, Absalom got what he deserved. He had it coming. But Joab will be held accountable for what he did to Absalom, both by God and eventually by David. You can read that in 1 Kings chapter 2. So, Absalom is still not dead after 3 spears. And by the way, the word heart that you read there in the English rendering in your Bible, as translated from the original, is a general reference to the middle area of the body, the torso area of the body, instead of a specific internal organ. But they speared him and they killed him, and they threw him in a big pit in the woods, and they covered him with a big pile of rocks. And when this happened, all the Israelites made a run for it. Absalom's army was now in full retreat. So look at verse 18. During his lifetime, Absalom had taken a pillar and erected it in the king's valley as a monument to, see that? To himself. For he thought, I have no son to carry on my name, and he named the pillar after himself. And it is called Absalom's monument to this day. And I read that and I think that is exactly what we would expect from self-centered, self-promoting Absalom. He had a memorial in life, but Joab made certain he did not have a memorial in death. They buried him under a pile of rocks. So David now is going to have to hear the news. Well, we're to the text for the morning, and let's begin by reading 19 to 27. Now Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, said, Let me run and take the news to the king that the Lord has delivered him from the hand of his enemies. You are not the one to take the news today, Joab told him. You may take the news another time, but you must not do so today because the king's son is dead. Then Joab said to a Cushite, "Go tell the king what you have seen." And the Cushite bowed down before Joab and ran off. Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, again said to Joab, "Come what may, please let me run behind the Cushite." Joab replied, "My son, why do you want to go? You don't have any news that will bring you a reward." And he said, "Come what may, I want to run." So Joab said, "Run." Then Ahimaaz ran by the way of the plain and outran the Cushite. While David was sitting between the inner and outer gates, the watchman went up to the roof of the gateway by the wall. As he looked out, he saw a man running alone. And the watchman called out to the king and reported it. And the king said, "If he's alone, he must have good news." And the man came closer and closer. Then the watchman saw another man running, and he called down to the gatekeeper, "Look, another man running alone." And the king said, "He must be bringing good news too." The watchman said, "It seems to me that the first one runs like Ahimaaz, son of Zadok." "He's a good man," the king said. "He comes with good news." Ahimaaz wanted to take David the news of victory and of Absalom's death. Joab didn't want him to do that. Joab wanted to spare Ahimaaz the burden of being the messenger that brought such good news. And you can see in David's attitude, you can see in his words that he's running everything through the lens of, this has got to be good news. It's got to be the news I want to hear. Well, Ahimaaz was faster than the other runner, and since he was someone David knew, he assumed it was good news. Now let's add 28 to the end of the chapter. Then Ahimaaz called out to the king, "All is well." He bowed down before the king with his face to the ground and said, "Praise be to the Lord your God. He has delivered up the men who lifted their hands against my lord the king." And the king asked, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" Ahimaaz answered, "I saw great confusion just as Joab was about to send the king's servant and me, your servant, but I don't know what it was." Well, that wasn't exactly the honest truth, was it? That wasn't the unvarnished truth. The king said, "Stand aside and wait here." So he stepped aside and stood there. Then the Cushite arrived and said, "My lord the king, hear the good news. The Lord has delivered you today from all who rose up against you." And the king asked the Cushite, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" And the Cushite replied, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up to harm you be like that young man." The king was shaken. He went up to the room over the gateway and wept. As he went, he said those famous words that we've read, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you, oh Absalom, my son, my son." You look at this in the original Hebrew text, and it says that there was a violent trembling of David's body. And you know, you hate to say it. You hate to say it about David, but it is true. Some of the seeds that David had planted had now come to harvest. David recognized about his son, his weaknesses are my weaknesses, and his passions are my passions, and his sins are my sins. Don't you know that David understood clearly that he was reaping some of what had been sown in his life that was not right? Do you remember Nathan saying to him, "You are the man"? And you remember the scripture saying the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. David just wanted to die in place of his rebellious son. In the Companion, which is a commentary book that's provided to those of us who teach the quarterly, in the Companion, the following statement about this is written. On the one hand, David loved his son Absalom, but on the other, he seemed never to ask anything very difficult of him. Sometimes a parent does best for a child by giving the child clear responsibilities and by disapproving of some behavior and approving of other behavior. But David didn't do that. That wasn't David's style. David's sins have certainly now come to revisit him. And you can't help but hear the words that had been prophesied about all that had taken place in David's life. You can't help but hear them over and over again, that the sword did not and would not leave his house. It just wouldn't. Well, lesson number 6 that Dr. Lloyd will lead next week is entitled "David Returns to Jerusalem." And it begins with verse 9 of the next chapter, chapter 19. But what I want to do as we complete the context here is just fill in a few more details before he begins with that text next Sunday. The news has now come that Absalom is dead. Everybody's happy about it, except seemingly David. And we give David some grace. We give him some slack because we understand he's just lost one of his children. And it had to be heartbreaking regardless of the circumstances. The coup attempt is now over, and the kingdom is going to be in David's hands once again. But David is in terrible sorrow. He is in great sorrow over the loss of his son. And I want to add, and I think the inference of the text is very clear. There is great sorrow, but there has also got to be great guilt on David's part. He's got to feel an enormous amount of guilt of the train wreck that has become his family, that has become his own children, his sons. There's great guilt about all that Absalom has done. And there has to be great guilt and anguish on his part about a lack of correction, about a lack of punishment, about his stormy relationship, not just with this third son, but with other children as well. So we're just going to cheat a little bit into 19, and we read now from 2 Samuel 19. Let's look at the first 3 verses. Joab was told the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom. And for the whole army, the victory that day was turned into mourning. Because on that day, the troops heard it and said, the king is grieving for his son. So the men stole into the city that day as men steal in who are ashamed when they flee from battle. You see what's going on here? You see the focus and where all the attention has been placed. This was not good. Politically, for the king, this was not good. For the king as a great warrior, the warrior that he was, the leader of an army that was loyal to him, this was not good. Think about it. David's loyal and sacrificing supporters have gone out there and at the risk of their own lives, they've fought against their own countrymen. They've won the day for the glory of God, for the glory of the king, for the good of all of Israel. And now it seems that they are to be ashamed about that. They feel bad about the victory because David is overcome with excessive weeping and mourning over Absalom, over this traitor, over the one who tried to take the throne away from him, over the one who drove them all out of Jerusalem in the first place. You know, in the New Testament, in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 13, Paul gives a little warning to those of us who are believers, and he says, I do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning those who have fallen asleep. Remember that text? I don't want you to be ignorant about the people who've gone on before you, those who have died, because I don't want you to sorrow like the rest of the world that has no hope. You know, folks, Christians will sorrow at times. It's a part of our human existence. It's a part of making this journey through our fleshly lives. And we're going to sorrow in death, and we're going to sorrow in tragedy. But we're not supposed to sorrow like those who have no hope in God. That is not how it is supposed to be. And that theme is consistent and true all throughout the Scripture. We will all face the death of our loved ones. All of us have, in fact, faced that sorrow of the death of people that we loved and people that we've carried to the grave. We will all face our own mortality one day. Now, we may not like to think about it and talk about it, and there are people out there who even deny it, that it's not going to happen to them. But I can assure you that the ratio is 1 out of 1. For every one who is born, there's going to be one who is going to die. We will all face our own mortality someday. And the theme of Scripture is, but the difference with us is we have God, we have Jesus, we have hope. And so we do not see all of those inevitables the same way the world sees them. We do not deal with all of those the same way that the world deals with them. And David's excessive sorrow and all of this wailing about Absalom, my son, and it made his loyal friends and his loyal supporters feel ashamed instead of joyous and jubilant about the great victory that they had just accomplished for him. They did it for him. So Joab is going to speak up about it. Joab is going to address the king. Verses 4 through 7. The king covered his face and he cried aloud. Have we heard this before? We have. Oh, my son Absalom, oh, Absalom, my son, my son. Then Joab went into the house of the king and said, today you have humiliated all your men, who have just saved your life and the lives of your sons and daughters and the lives of our wives and concubines. You love those who hate you, and you hate those who love you. You have made it clear today that the commanders and their men mean nothing to you. I see that you would be pleased if Absalom were alive today and all of us were dead. You got to give him credit, don't you? He's got some guts, got some courage. Now go out and encourage your men. I swear by the Lord that if you don't go out, not a man will be left with you by nightfall. This will be worse for you than all the calamities that have come upon you from your youth till now. Wow. In the Jim Brown version of this, the Jim Brown translation of this, Joab goes in there and he gathers up his strength and he says to the king, suck it up, big boy. You need to quit crying over the one who was trying to take your life and our lives and your kingdom. You need to suck it up. Grow up. Be a man about this. David could not stop singing this song, my son, my son, my son. He's still locked into this excessive mourning and lack of perspective. He was mastered by his feelings. And feelings were never meant to master us. And man, I give Joab some credit. Got to give the guy credit for courage. You know, in that day and time, you speak to the king like this, and the king could say, you know what, I don't believe I want to hear that. And I know a surefire way to make sure I don't ever hear that from you again. Somebody take him outside and cut his head off. Got to give Joab courage and strength. He had had enough. David's problem was not in what he knew. Absalom's tragic death and David's own role in it. David's problem was in what he forgot. He forgot that this was all part of a much bigger, broader, longer master plan that belonged to God. God was still in control, and there was a great victory as a part of that plan that had now been won. He had many, many loyal supporters who put their lives on the line for him. God has demonstrated one more time, this is one of many times in David's life that God has demonstrated great mercy and great grace to David. He'd done it once again. And when someone is overcome in tragedy and sorrow, often the problem is not in what they know, the problem is in what they forget. You know, it's interesting to me as I read the life story of David, particularly this event, and I think about it. I don't ever remember reading anywhere David crying out, oh, Uriah, Uriah, Uriah. My loyal soldier, my loyal mighty man, my loyal fighting man. Oh, Uriah, Uriah, I should have died instead of you. What I did was so terrible and so wrong. Should have been me instead of you. I don't ever remember reading that. So Joab just marches in with a very stern wake-up call, and he says, David, King, all this excessive mourning and wailing is selfish. It isn't all about you. And these loyal, sacrificial supporters, they deserve better than this from you. They deserve to feel good about the victory that they fought for you. And you are making them feel just the opposite. You just need to suck it up and stop all this. Go out and encourage the team. They deserve it. And then he gives him what I think is a very prophetic warning. I think it's absolutely true. Friend, if you don't, let me tell you, before it gets dark, you won't have a man left. There won't be a supporter of David. And the end result's going to be worse than what you thought. So verse 8. To David's credit, verse 8. So, the king got up, took his seat in the gateway, And when the men were told the king is sitting in the gateway, they all came before him. It is exactly what they needed to see. They needed to see David out there in his seat, in his place of authority. And you know what it told them? It told them that their sacrifice was worth it. His presence in that seat of authority told them that it was appreciated. It told them that David now intended to continue his reign. Joab's rebuke worked because Joab cared enough to make it. And David, to his credit, and I want to give him full credit, he cared enough to come to his senses and to receive it. This is indeed, it's quite a story. It's really a good story. And so, you remember what happened next? Do you remember? Dr. Lloyd will explain every bit of it next Sunday, all right? I appreciate you being in our class this morning. Thank you so much. I hope you'll read ahead. Look forward to next week's lesson. Thank you.